Judge Nora Whitman believed in the justice system. She believed in rules, evidence, and the clean logic of the law. But everything changes when a familiar name crosses her docket: Sam Brooks, a man accused of robbery and assault. To the courtroom, Sam is just another defendant, another file in a stack of cases. But to Nora, he is someone she once knew, a boy from her childhood who had taught her about courage, kindness, and the invisible lines that divided their small town of Hammond, Louisiana. As the trial unfolds, the case against Sam seems simple at first: a grainy video, missing evidence, and assumptions made too quickly. Yet with each testimony and detail, Nora begins to see cracks in the story presented to her. Doubt settles in, and with it, an uncomfortable truth. Justice isn't always as clear as it seems. Torn between her duty as a judge and her memories of a boy who once dreamed of leaving their small town behind, Nora must navigate the fine line between the law she upholds and the humanity she cannot ignore. The hum of voices echoed faintly in the courtroom. Wooden benches creaked as spectators shifted in their seats, the quiet murmurs blending with the rustling of papers. The air carried the faint scent of polish from the oak furniture, a reminder of the formality of the place. Behind the elevated bench, Judge Nora Whitman sat, her expression steady and unreadable. It was a mask she had perfected over the years. Nora's black robes hung heavily on her shoulders that morning, though no one would have noticed. She listened as the bailiff called the case: the state of Louisiana versus Sam Brooks. She straightened slightly in her seat, placing her hands on the smooth, polished wood of the bench. It was a ritual of sorts, a way to ground herself before the routine of justice began. Assault, robbery, resisting, arrest. The words sat on the docket in front of her, cold and lifeless. She scanned the charges, the familiar ache of disappointment settling in her chest. Another case, she thought. Another life tangled in the system. Then the defendant was brought into the room. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, a man in a faded, ill-fitting suit shuffled forward. He kept his head low, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. Nora looked up, ready to hear his name read formally into the record. Her gaze froze. The room around her seemed to tilt. The man in shackles was not a stranger. It was Sam Brooks, her Sam. Nora's throat tightened, and for the briefest moment, her mask slipped. The flood of memories hit her so quickly that it almost took her breath away. Summer afternoons spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond. Late nights sitting beneath the old magnolia tree in her backyard, whispering dreams about leaving their small, divided town behind. The promises they had made as kids to always have each other's backs. Yet here he was, standing before her like a ghost. The boy she had known had disappeared, replaced by a man whose face was lined with hardship. His hair was streaked with gray, his posture guarded. But his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, had not changed. "Mr. Brooks," the bailiff prompted. Sam looked up, recognition flickering in his tired eyes before he dropped his gaze. It was as though he had already resigned himself to whatever judgment would come. Nora's grip on the gavel faltered for the first time in her career. She forced herself to look at the papers again, to focus, to breathe. "Mr. Brooks, you stand accused of assault and robbery," she said, her voice even though her heart raced. "How do you plead?" The man shifted, his chains clinking softly against the floor. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he replied. His voice was rough, weathered by time, yet unmistakably his. Nora's pulse thudded in her ears. She wanted to stop everything. She wanted to demand answers. "What happened to you, Sam? Where did life take you after Hammond?" But she was a judge, and in this room, her role was not personal. It was the law. "Proceed," she said, her voice steady, though it felt like a lie. The prosecutor began his opening statement, laying out the case against Sam. Nora listened, but her mind wandered to a distant time, a simpler time. Hammond, Louisiana, was small and quiet, divided not by distance, but by unspoken rules that had shaped generations. Nora grew up in a modest, one-story house with a white picket fence and a manicured lawn. Her parents had worked hard for what they had: her father a factory foreman, her mother a schoolteacher. Just across town, on the far end of a dirt road surrounded by fields, was where Sam Brooks lived. His family's house was weathered and leaning, the paint peeling in places. The screen door hung crooked on its hinges. Nora had been told more than once that good girls like her had no business on that side of town. But one summer day, everything changed. Nora had wandered too far from her backyard. The day was hot, the sun hanging high in the sky. She remembered kicking off her sandals and stepping barefoot into the cool water of the creek that marked the edge of her world. That was when she heard the sound of muttering and splashing. She turned to see a boy about her age, standing knee-deep in the water, tugging at a fishing line tangled in the reeds. "You're going to snap it if you pull too hard," she called out before she could stop herself. The boy looked up sharply, startled. His eyes narrowed. "What do you know about fishing?" Nora folded her arms. "More than you, obviously. You're doing it wrong." The boy hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. Show me." Nora stepped into the creek, the mud squelching between her toes. Together they untangled the line. By the time they finished, the boy had cracked a shy grin. "I'm Sam," he said, wiping his hands on his shorts. "Nora," she replied. That afternoon they sat on the bank of the creek, talking. Sam told her about his family, about how his father worked 2 jobs and his mother sold preserves at the local market. Nora listened, fascinated. His world felt so far from hers, yet something about him felt familiar, real. Over the summer, they met at the creek often. Sam taught her how to bait a hook and catch minnows with her bare hands. She showed him how to skip stones across the water. Their friendship grew in secret, hidden from the judging eyes of Hammond. But Sam saw the world for what it was. Even then, one night, as they lay side by side on the grass, staring at the stars, he whispered, "You ever think about leaving this place, Nora? Somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" Nora had laughed then, brushing off the thought. "We'll leave someday," she said. "We'll make something of ourselves." But even as a child, Sam had known that dreams were fragile things. Nora's father ended it. It happened one afternoon when Nora and Sam sat on her porch, sipping sweet tea and laughing about something silly. Her father's truck rumbled up the driveway. He stepped out and froze, his expression hardening as he looked at Sam. "Nora, inside," he said, his voice cold. Nora hesitated. "But now." Sam rose to his feet, his posture tense. "It's okay," he said softly. "Go on." She wanted to stay, to argue, but her father's tone left no room for disobedience. She turned to Sam, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll see you tomorrow." But she didn't. Her father forbade her from going near Sam, and not long after, Sam's family moved away. Nora threw herself into school, into her ambitions, into leaving Hammond behind. She graduated at the top of her class, went to law school, and eventually became a judge. Over the years, she buried the memories of Sam and that summer deep within herself. It was easier that way. The prosecutor's voice pulled her back to the present. The defendant was picked up 2 blocks from the scene with cash allegedly in his possession. Nora studied Sam as the charges were laid out against him. His face remained impassive, but she could see the tension in his jaw. Did he really do it? The question burned in her mind. Or had the system, once again, decided that a man like Sam Brooks fit the bill? The trial adjourned for lunch, and Nora returned to her chambers. She sat at her desk, staring at the stack of files in front of her, but seeing nothing. The walls of her office felt closer than usual, the silence too loud. A soft knock on the door broke the quiet. Sarah, her assistant, peeked in. "Judge Whitman, are you all right?" You seemed a little distracted today. Nora forced a small smile. Just a lot on my mind, Sarah. Thank you. Sarah lingered for a moment, her brow furrowed. Then, without another word, she set a cup of coffee on Nora's desk before leaving. Nora stared at the steaming mug. It was such a small thing, an unexpected act of kindness, but in that moment, it felt significant. It reminded her of something she had forgotten long ago. Kindness matters. Even when the world feels unforgiving. Nora leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The trial had only just begun, but the weight of it already felt immense. What happened to you, Sam? She vowed to find out. The sound of chains echoed faintly as Sam Brooks was escorted back into the courtroom. The officers walked on either side of him, their steps deliberate and heavy. Nora Whitman sat at the bench, her face calm, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The judge's mask was firmly in place once more, but the battle within her had not quieted. She forced herself to focus as the prosecutor, David Sharp, rose to call his first witness. The court stenographer's keys clacked rhythmically, documenting every word. The state calls Officer Randall Grant to the stand. A tall, square-jawed man in a crisp uniform stepped forward. He took the oath and settled into the witness chair, his expression blank and professional. Officer Grant, David began, pacing methodically, you were the first to respond to the reported robbery at the convenience store on Jackson Street in Baton Rouge, correct? Yes, sir, Officer Grant replied. And can you describe what happened when you arrived? We received a call around 10:30 p.m. about an assault and robbery. I drove to the scene with my partner. The store clerk described a man in his 40s, black, wearing dark clothing, who had attacked him, jumped over the counter, and emptied the register. The suspect fled on foot. A patrol unit picked up Mr. Brooks about 2 blocks away. David nodded, his face sharp with confidence. Was Mr. Brooks in possession of the stolen cash when you apprehended him? Yes, he had cash on him. And did he match the description given by the store clerk? Officer Grant glanced briefly at Sam before answering. Yes, sir. A black male in dark clothing. David turned to the jury, letting the weight of those words linger for a moment. No further questions. Nora watched Sam out of the corner of her eye. He sat silently at the defense table, his hands clasped together, his posture rigid. The chains were gone, but something about him still looked bound, as if he had been carrying the weight of his circumstances for far too long. Rachel Myers, his attorney, stood slowly. She was young but composed, with a sharpness that reminded Nora of herself years ago. Officer Grant, Rachel began, walking toward the witness stand. You testified that Mr. Brooks was wearing dark clothing. Did the store clerk mention anything about a red hoodie? Officer Grant's brow furrowed slightly. Yes, the suspect was initially described as wearing a red hoodie, but— And did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Brooks's possession? No, we didn't. Rachel paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the jury take notice. Did you search the surrounding area for this red hoodie? Officer Grant's jaw tightened. No, ma'am. Mr. Brooks matched the description otherwise, and the clerk identified him. The clerk identified him, or said he matched the description. Officer Grant shifted uncomfortably. He matched the description. Rachel offered a polite smile. No further questions, Your Honor. Nora watched as Rachel returned to her seat, her calm demeanor never wavering. She turned her gaze to the jury, noting a few members exchanging uncertain glances. For the first time that day, Nora felt a flicker of hope that someone in that room might see the cracks forming in the prosecution's case. The court adjourned for a short recess, and Nora retreated to her chambers. She closed the door behind her and sank into the chair at her desk, rubbing her temples. Her mind refused to quiet. Officer Grant's testimony seemed clean on the surface, but Rachel had tugged at a thread. A red hoodie. The clerk hadn't seen the suspect's face clearly, only the shape of a man, the color of his clothes. Yet Sam Brooks was sitting here, accused. Nora leaned back, staring at the ceiling as memories of Hammond came rushing back. It had been a few weeks after her father forbade her from seeing Sam. The summer heat hung thick and heavy in the air, and Nora spent her days wandering her family's small house, listless and restless. She missed the creek. She missed Sam's easy smile and the way he seemed to understand her in ways no one else did. One afternoon, as her father napped in the living room, Nora found herself at the edge of her backyard, staring toward the line of trees that marked the start of Sam's side of town. "You shouldn't go near there," her mother had warned her, her voice firm. "Those people live a different kind of life, Nora. You stay where you belong." Nora remembered nodding back then, pretending to understand. But in her heart, she couldn't let go of the feeling that something was wrong, that something was unfair about those invisible lines that divided her world. One day, a small envelope arrived in the mail, addressed to her in clumsy handwriting she recognized immediately. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a piece of lined notebook paper, folded carefully. "Nora," it read, "I'm sorry I didn't get to say goodbye. We had to move, but I'll remember you. Thanks for being my friend." It was unsigned, but it didn't need to be. That note had stayed with her, tucked in the back of a drawer, long after she left Hammond. For years, she would come across it when cleaning, her fingers brushing the paper like it was fragile. She would hold it briefly, remembering that summer, before tucking it away again. Now, sitting in her chambers, Nora wondered what had happened to Sam after that letter. How had he ended up here? Had life been nothing but a series of hard choices and closed doors? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, Sarah, poked her head in. "Judge Whitman?" "Yes? I thought you might need this." Sarah stepped inside, placing a cup of tea on Nora's desk. "I know you usually don't take tea, but it's calming. It might help." Nora blinked, surprised. "Thank you, Sarah." Sarah offered a small smile. "It's no trouble. You just seemed like you had a lot on your mind." Nora nodded as Sarah slipped out of the room. She looked down at the cup of tea, the steam curling faintly in the air. It was such a small act, so simple and kind, that it caught her off guard. She thought about Sam again. Had anyone shown him that kind of kindness in the years since Hammond? Or had the world closed its doors, one after the other, until he stopped hoping someone might care? When court resumed, David Sharp moved quickly to call the next witness, the store clerk. A man in his 30s stepped hesitantly to the stand. He took the oath, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Carson," David began, "can you describe what you saw the night of the robbery?" The clerk nodded. "A man came in. He was wearing a red hoodie. I was behind the counter, counting the till. He came up and started yelling at me. Before I knew it, he lunged over and grabbed the cash." "Did you see the man's face clearly?" The clerk hesitated. Not real clear. He had the hood up. It was dark." David's expression hardened slightly. "But you're confident that the man was Mr. Brooks?" The clerk swallowed, glancing nervously at Sam before answering. "He looked like him. Same build, same height." Rachel rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Carson, you mentioned the suspect wore a red hoodie. Are you certain about that detail?" "Yes, ma'am." "And yet, when Mr. Brooks was arrested, he was not wearing a red hoodie. Isn't that true?" The clerk fidgeted. "I guess so, but—" "And you just testified that you didn't see his face clearly. So you assumed it was him?" The clerk's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Rachel turned to the jury, her voice calm but firm. "No further questions." Nora watched as the first crack appeared in the prosecution's case. The jury shifted uneasily in their seats, their confidence shaken. Sam sat a little straighter in his chair. As the day drew to a close, Nora realized something profound. Doubt had begun to settle in the room. For the first time, she wondered if the system she had sworn to uphold had failed Sam Brooks before the trial even began. And if it had, What would she do about it? The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Nora Whitman sat at the bench, her gavel resting unused beside her hand. The faint murmur of footsteps and shuffling papers drifted through the room as the bailiff called the next witness. The state calls Officer Daniel Harris to the stand. A heavy-set man with a buzz cuts and a stern expression stepped forward, his boots thudding on the polished floor. Officer Harris took the oath, his gaze fixed forward, avoiding the defendant's table where Sam Brooks sat. Sam's posture was still rigid, almost as if he were bracing for impact. Nora observed Harris carefully as he settled into the chair. His shoulders were squared, his eyes sharp. A man who believed in the system, she thought. A man who believed his actions were just. David Sharp, the prosecutor, rose from his seat, his movements confident and methodical. Officer Harris, can you describe the events leading up to Mr. Brooks's arrest? Yes, sir, Harris replied. His voice was clipped, as though recounting the night was merely another box to check. At approximately 10:45 p.m., we were patrolling 2 blocks from the convenience store where the robbery took place. We spotted Mr. Brooks walking on the sidewalk. He matched the description we received: black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing. Did you approach Mr. Brooks? Yes. We stopped him, asked him to explain where he was coming from. And what was his response? He said he was walking home from a friend's house. He appeared nervous, which raised suspicion. David nodded. And during the search, what did you find? Harris shifted slightly in his seat, a wad of cash in his pocket. Did Mr. Brooks resist arrest? Harris's mouth tightened. He was agitated. He didn't fight, but he refused to cooperate at first. David turned toward the jury, letting Harris's words hang in the air for effect. No further questions, Your Honor. Nora shifted her gaze to Rachel Myers, who stood with a deliberate calm. Rachel's sharp heels tapped softly as she walked toward the stand. She stopped just short of Harris, her small frame a contrast to his imposing presence. Officer Harris, she began, her voice steady, you testified that Mr. Brooks matched the description given by the store clerk. Can you clarify what this description entailed? Harris's brow furrowed slightly. Black male, mid-40s, dark clothing. Rachel raised an eyebrow. And did the description include any identifying facial features? No. Did it mention the red hoodie the clerk described earlier? Harris paused. It did, but we didn't find a red hoodie. Rachel nodded. So, you arrested Mr. Brooks based on vague descriptors and the presence of cash. Is that correct? Harris's jaw tightened. It matched what we were looking for. Did you search the area for the red hoodie? No, ma'am. We apprehended the suspect quickly. Rachel tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. Officer Harris, you stated that Mr. Brooks appeared nervous. Is it possible that being stopped unexpectedly by police late at night could make anyone nervous, even if they had done nothing wrong? Harris shifted in his seat, his voice clipped. I can't speak to that. Fair enough, Rachel said softly, pausing to let the jury absorb her words. No further questions, Your Honor. Nora glanced at the jury as Rachel returned to her seat. A few of them looked uneasy, their confidence in the prosecution's case clearly shaken. The cracks were widening, and the room could feel it. The court adjourned for lunch, and Nora retreated to her chambers, her thoughts swirling. She sat at her desk, hands folded in her lap, as she replayed Officer Harris's testimony in her mind. He matched the description. How often had those words been used to justify assumptions, to close cases quickly and cleanly, without asking the harder questions? Nora stood and crossed to the small window in her office. The courthouse overlooked a narrow, busy street lined with cars and storefronts. People moved hurriedly below, their lives rolling forward with purpose. What about Sam's life? She had to admit the truth to herself. She had been holding her breath since the moment Sam Brooks walked into her courtroom. Seeing him had opened something inside her, a door she had carefully kept shut for years. It wasn't just about Sam, it was about the system, about fairness, about everything she believed she had fought for in her career. But now, she wasn't so sure. Nora's childhood memories flooded back without invitation. Hammond, her small Louisiana hometown, had been split into two sides: those who had enough and those who didn't. Those who were given the benefit of the doubt and those who never were. Her side of town had quiet streets and modest homes, where fathers went to work and mothers greeted neighbors with nods and small smiles. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean and predictable. Sam's side was different. She remembered the first time she walked to Sam's house. The dirt road seemed to stretch forever, the heat rising in waves from the ground. The houses were older, the yards untidy, dogs barked as she passed, and she felt eyes on her people peeking out from behind thin curtains. "Where are you going?" Sam had asked her that day, his voice uncertain as he found her on his street. "I wanted to see where you lived," Nora had said simply. He looked at her then, his face caught between surprise and something else, a wariness she hadn't understood at the time. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. "People will talk." "I don't care," she said stubbornly, and for a while it felt like the world had bent to their friendship, like they had carved out their own space where the rules didn't apply. But that had been a lie. Nora leaned her head against the cool glass of her window now, feeling that old, familiar guilt return. "You shouldn't be here." Sam's words had echoed in her mind for years. Had she failed him then? The knock on her door startled her. Nora turned to see Sarah, her assistant, holding a small paper bag and a coffee. "I thought you might need something to eat," Sarah said hesitantly. "You skipped lunch yesterday, so—" Nora blinked, caught off guard by the small gesture. "You didn't have to do that, Sarah." "I know," Sarah replied with a shrug, "but sometimes we all need a little help." Nora smiled faintly as Sarah set the bag on her desk. Thank you." "You're welcome, Judge Whitman." Sarah hesitated, then added softly, "You know, my uncle had a run-in with the law a few years ago. He wasn't a bad man, but no one would listen. I think about him sometimes when I hear these cases." Nora's gaze softened. "I'm sorry to hear that." Sarah offered a small nod. "It's just, I hope people realize that not everything is as simple as it looks." As Sarah left, Nora sat heavily in her chair. The paper bag crinkled as she opened it, revealing a sandwich and a cookie. It wasn't much, but it warmed something in her chest, reminding her that even small kindnesses could carry weight. She thought about Sam. Had he ever known moments like this? A hand extended, a voice that said, "I see you. I believe in you." She realized then that this wasn't just about the law. It was about what the law was supposed to be: a force that lifted people, not one that crushed them under assumptions and shadows. The courtroom filled again, the afternoon sun streaming through the high windows. Nora resumed her seat as Rachel stood, ready to call her next witness. The defense calls Dr. Arthur Lang, a forensic video analyst. A middle-aged man in a dark suit stepped forward. He was calm and confident, his hands folded neatly as he took the oath. Rachel approached the stand. "Dr. Lang, you reviewed the surveillance footage from the convenience store robbery. Can you share your findings?" "Yes, ma'am," Lang replied. "The footage was poor quality, grainy, and dark. Based on my analysis, the height and build of the suspect in the video do not definitively match Mr. Brooks." The jury stirred slightly. Rachel pressed on. "Could the person in the video be someone else entirely?" "It's entirely possible," Lang said firmly. Nora watched as David Sharp rose quickly to object, but the damage had been done. The room could feel it, the doubt creeping into every corner. Sam sat still at the defense table, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time, Nora thought she saw the faintest flicker of hope cross his face. And for the first time, Nora believed that there might be more to this story than what met the eye. The courtroom settled into a steady hum of anticipation as Dr. Arthur Lang stepped down from the stand. His testimony, though clinical and precise, had stirred something deep in the room, an uncomfortable shadow of doubt. Nora Whitman watched from her elevated bench, her face as still as stone, though inside, her thoughts churned restlessly. The evidence, thin as it was, hung like a fraying rope holding the weight of the case. The grainy surveillance videos, the missing red hoodie, the vague description. For all its polish, the prosecution's case had begun to unravel, thread by fragile thread. Nora stole a glance at Sam Brooks. He sat at the defense table, his posture still rigid, his face unreadable. Yet something had shifted, ever so slightly, in the way he held himself. The faintest spark of hope had settled in his eyes, and Nora, for the first time, saw the ghost of the boy she had once known. "Don't get ahead of yourself," she warned silently. The law was not about hope. It was about facts, evidence, and yet the memory of Sam's quiet dignity lingered like an ache she could not shake. "Your Honor," Rachel Myers said as she stood, her voice calm but firm, "the defense requests a short recess before proceeding with our next witness." David Sharp shot up from his chair, clearly annoyed. "Your Honor, the state objects. This is just a delay tactic." Nora glanced from Rachel to Sharp. She could sense Rachel's urgency. Something was happening behind the scenes. "Ms. Myers, how long of a recess do you need?" 15 minutes, Your Honor." Nora paused, her gavel resting lightly in her hand. "Very well. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. She struck the gavel once, the sound echoing sharply through the room. The courtroom emptied quickly, spectators and jurors stretching their legs or murmuring to each other as they filed out. Nora stood slowly and retreated to her chambers, where Sarah was already waiting with a file tucked under her arm. "You think she's onto something?" Sarah asked as Nora eased into her chair. "Maybe," Nora replied carefully. "Rachel wouldn't ask for a recess unless it mattered. She's too sharp for that." Sarah tilted her head, studying her. "It's hard for you, isn't it?" "What is?" Nora asked. Though she already knew, Sarah hesitated, choosing her words with care. "Seeing someone you knew, someone from your past. It's strange how life brings people back to us when we least expect it." Nora sighed softly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the sky was a pale shade of blue, streaked with thin clouds. "Sometimes, I wonder if we ever really leave the past behind," she murmured, "or if we just bury it under layers of ambition and forgetfulness." Sarah didn't respond right away, but her voice was gentle when she finally spoke. "You know, Judge Whitman, the past doesn't have to be something we run from. Maybe it's something we can make peace with." Nora glanced at her assistant, touched by the quiet wisdom in her words. "Maybe." Sarah set the file down on Nora's desk. "I thought you might want the original police report again. I flagged a couple of things that stood out." Nora looked down at the file, grateful. "Thank you, Sarah." As Sarah left, Nora flipped the file open, her eyes scanning the pages. She had read it before, but this time she looked more closely, searching for anything she might have missed. When court resumed, Rachel Myers stood ready with her next witness. The tension in the room had sharpened. Even David Sharp, always so confident, looked unsettled as he straightened his tie and took his seat. "Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. Alvin Thompson to the stand," Rachel said. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as an older man with hunched shoulders and weathered hands made his way to the witness stand. He wore an oversized jacket and a cap pulled low over his brow. Sam turned sharply, his eyes widening with shock, Nora noticed. "Who is this man?" she wondered. Rachel smiled warmly as Alvin settled into his seat. "Mr. Thompson, can you please introduce yourself to the court?" The man cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady. "My name's Alvin Thompson. I work maintenance over at the old Crawford building on the edge of town." Rachel nodded. "Mr. Thompson, Do you know the defendant, Mr. Sam Brooks? Alvin glanced at Sam, his expression softening slightly. Yeah, I know him. He helped me out a couple months back. Can you explain what you mean by that? The older man shifted, gripping his hands together. Well, I was stuck one night. Car broke down on the side of the road. Engine wouldn't start. Most people just drove on by, didn't even look twice. But then Sam here stopped. He didn't know me, didn't owe me nothing, but he stayed. Helped me push my car to the side, and he stayed with me until a tow truck came. Rachel's voice was soft. And this was late at night, correct? Yeah, real late. Do you remember what Mr. Brooks was wearing that night? The man squinted as he thought. He had a dark coat on, and I remember 'cause he said he'd been walking home from a friend's house, same direction as where I'd seen him. Rachel paused, giving the jury time to absorb the connection. So to clarify, you're saying Mr. Brooks was walking home that night and he stopped to help you? Alvin nodded firmly. That's right. David Sharp shot up. Objection, Your Honor. This testimony is irrelevant. It doesn't place the defendant anywhere near the scene of the crime. Rachel turned calmly to Nora. Your Honor, it establishes Mr. Brooks's character and his presence elsewhere that night. Nora looked at Sharp. Overruled. The jury will consider this testimony. As Alvin stepped down, Nora noticed Sam looking at him, a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as though he couldn't believe someone had shown up for him. When court adjourned for the day, Nora lingered behind on the bench as the room emptied. Sam stood near the defense table, waiting to be escorted back. For the first time, their eyes met fully across the room. There was no anger in his gaze, no pleading, only resignation, and beneath that, something softer, something that reminded her of the boy she had known. As the bailiff approached to escort Sam away, Nora felt herself hesitate. It wasn't the kind of hesitation the courtroom permitted, but it was human. Mr. Brooks, she said suddenly, her voice steady. Sam turned, surprised. Even the bailiff stopped. You've had a long day. I hope you rest well tonight, Nora said simply. Sam blinked, as though the words confused him. Kindness in a courtroom was rare, and it showed in his face. He didn't know what to do with it. But then he nodded once, the faintest ghost of a smile crossing his lips. Thank you, Your Honor, he replied softly. Nora watched him leave, the words lingering in the air between them. It wasn't much. It wouldn't fix the years of hardship or the weight of assumptions. But it was something, a small kindness, in a place where Sam Brooks had rarely been shown any. That night, Nora sat alone in her living room, the lights dim, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan filling the silence. She sipped her tea slowly, staring at the file spread open on the coffee table before her. Sam Brooks. His name was typed neatly on the front of the report, as though his life could be contained in those few pages. But Nora knew better. She thought of Alvin Thompson's story, of Sam stopping to help when no one else would. She thought of Rachel Myers fighting to pull the truth from the cracks. And then she thought of Sarah bringing her tea. The small kindnesses that people offered, unexpected, unprompted, sometimes they were what mattered most. The truth wasn't always clear-cut. Sometimes it took courage to look closer, to question the story everyone else was content to believe. And sometimes, Nora realized, it took courage just to show up, to extend a hand, even when the world said you didn't have to. Nora leaned back on the couch, her mind heavy but focused. The trial wasn't over, and the burden of fairness still sat squarely on her shoulders. But for the first time, she felt something close to clarity. She couldn't change the past, but she could face it, and maybe, just maybe, she could help someone else find a way forward. The courtroom felt colder the next morning, the kind of chill that didn't come from the air conditioning, but from something deeper, the weight of what was at stake. Nora Whitman walked through the tall wooden doors of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Each step echoed back at her, a reminder of her position, her power, and the burden of it all. By now, the tension in the room had taken on a life of its own. Jurors fidgeted. The prosecution's table was piled with documents like a fortress of conviction, and Sam Brooks sat at the defense table, unmoving, the bags under his eyes darker than they had been the day before. Nora settled into her seat on the bench and looked down at him. Sam's head was bowed slightly, but his shoulders were squared, as though he was determined not to let the room swallow him whole. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "Please be seated." The room rustled briefly as everyone obeyed. Nora let her gaze fall on Rachel Myers. Rachel looked sharp as ever, but there was an added urgency to her movements, the kind that only comes when someone knows the truth is close, just barely out of reach. "Your Honor," Rachel said as she stood, "the defense calls Officer Randall Grant back to the stand for further questioning." A murmur rippled through the room as the officer, who had testified earlier, rose from his seat in the gallery and made his way back to the stand. Nora raised an eyebrow slightly, curious about where Rachel was going with this. Rachel approached the witness stand, her hands clasped behind her back. Her expression was calm, but her sharp eyes were locked on Randall Grant. "Officer Grant," Rachel began, her voice even, "you testified earlier about the events of Mr. Brooks's arrest. I'd like to revisit the circumstances of that night." The officer frowned slightly but nodded. "All right. You stated that Mr. Brooks was found 2 blocks away from the convenience store, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And that he had cash in his possession." "That's correct." Rachel paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "During the search of Mr. Brooks, did you locate any fingerprints on the cash that would confirm it came from the convenience store?" Officer Grant's brow furrowed. "No, we didn't dust for prints." Rachel tilted her head, her expression pointed. "Why not?" Grant shifted in his seat. "It wasn't necessary. The cash matched what was reported missing, and he fit the description." Rachel took a slow breath, letting the room feel the weight of his answer. "Let me clarify. You assumed the cash came from the store. You did not confirm it." Grant hesitated. "It was the logical conclusion." "Logical," Rachel repeated softly, as though testing the word. She turned to the jury. "Officer Grant, earlier you testified that the store clerk said the suspect was wearing a red hoodie, correct?" "Yes." "And when Mr. Brooks was arrested, he was not wearing a red hoodie. You confirmed that?" Grant's jaw tightened. "Correct." Rachel took a step closer, her voice steady but rising slightly. "Did you or any of your fellow officers search the area to see if a red hoodie had been discarded?" "No." "And why not?" "We didn't have reason to believe." "You didn't have reason?" Rachel cut in, her tone sharpening. "You arrested Mr. Brooks based on assumptions that matched a vague description and unverified cash. But you didn't investigate beyond that. Isn't that true?" Grant's face reddened. "We followed procedure." "Procedure," Rachel said softly. "And yet here we are, with no red hoodie, no fingerprints, and no real evidence beyond assumptions." David Sharp stood abruptly. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness." Nora straightened. "Sustained. Ms. Myers, move on." Rachel turned back to the jury, her voice softening but firm. "No further questions, Your Honor." Nora watched as Officer Grant left the stand, his posture stiffer than when he had arrived. Rachel's cross-examination had done its work. Another crack had appeared in the case. Nora glanced at Sam. His expression had not changed, but his hands were no longer clenched as tightly together. The morning dragged on with procedural motions and dry legal exchanges, but Nora's mind lingered on the questions Rachel had raised. The missing red hoodie, the untested cash, the officer's words' logical conclusion. She had spent years hearing phrases like that. People trusted the system because it was clean on the surface, because it gave them answers that made sense, even if those answers weren't the truth. It had taken Nora years to climb to her seat on the bench. Years of working twice as hard to prove herself in courtrooms that rarely looked like her. And yet, she realized with a bitter clarity that the same system she had served had taken shortcuts with men like Sam Brooks, men who had never been given the benefit of the doubt. The thought settled uncomfortably in her chest as she called for the afternoon recess. Nora's chambers were quiet as she sat at her desk, reading through the police report again. Rachel's cross-examination had rattled her. She saw now what Rachel was trying to do, pull at the threads of doubt until the entire case unraveled. There was a knock at her door. "Come in," Nora called. Sarah stepped inside, a folder tucked under her arm. "I thought you might want this," she said, placing the folder on Nora's desk. "What is it?" Nora asked. "I found the original incident report from the convenience store clerk," Sarah replied. "You might want to look at his statement." Nora opened the folder, her eyes scanning the page. The clerk had indeed described a man in a red hoodie, but there was something else, a detail she hadn't seen before. "The suspect was agitated," Nora read aloud. "He argued with the clerk before lunging over the counter. He kept saying something about a misunderstanding." Sarah frowned. "A misunderstanding? That doesn't sound like someone trying to rob a store." Nora's mind whirled. "No, it doesn't." Sarah hesitated before speaking. "Do you think he's innocent?" Nora's response came slowly. "I think we don't have all the answers yet." The afternoon session resumed with Rachel calling her next witness, Sam himself. The courtroom fell silent as Sam Brooks stood. He moved carefully, almost cautiously, as he approached the stand. Nora watched him closely, unable to look away. She remembered the boy she once knew, the one who taught her how to skip stones, who had laughed freely under the magnolia tree. Now, that boy was gone. In his place was a man whose life had been heavy with struggle, a man who stood before her with chains she could not see but knew were there. Rachel approached the stand. "Mr. Brooks, can you tell the court where you were the night of the incident?" Sam's voice was rough but steady. "I was walking home. I'd been at a friend's house earlier, just talking, nothing special." "Did you stop anywhere on your way home?" Sam nodded. "Yeah. There was a man, his car had broken down on the side of the road. I stopped to help him." "Why did you stop, Mr. Brooks?" Sam looked straight at Rachel, his voice quiet. "Because no one else did." The courtroom fell into a hush. "And when the police stopped you, what did you say to them?" Rachel pressed. Sam's jaw tightened. "I told them I hadn't done anything. I told them I was innocent." Rachel paused. "Did they listen?" Sam's gaze dropped. "No." Nora swallowed hard, the words settling heavily in her chest. Because no one else did. For the first time in years, she realized how loud silence could be. The quiet in the courtroom deepened as Sam Brooks returned to his seat at the defense table. Nora watched him closely, noting the way he walked steady but careful, as though the years and the burdens they carried had taught him to be cautious with every step. His testimony still echoed in the room, because no one else did. It was such a simple statement, yet it struck a chord that Nora couldn't ignore. For years, she had believed in the justice system. She had relied on its rules, its order, its insistence on evidence and procedure. Yet as Sam sat back down, she could see what the system had taken from him, not just his time, but the quiet dignity of being seen, of being believed. Rachel Myers sat beside Sam, whispering something to him, no doubt an encouragement, a reassurance that he had done well on the stand. David Sharp, however, wore an expression that was a mix of frustration and skepticism as he rose to deliver his cross-examination. Nora leaned forward slightly, bracing herself for what would come next. "Mr. Brooks," David Sharp began, his voice sharp and deliberate, "you testified that you were walking home the night of the incident. You also said you stopped to help a man with a broken-down car." "Yes," Sam replied, his voice even. "And yet," Sharp continued, "this man, this supposed witness, has not come forward to testify on your behalf. Why is that?" Sam hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe he doesn't want to get involved." David's eyes narrowed. "Convenient, don't you think? A mysterious man who can't be located, whose name you can't even remember, just happened to need your help that night." "It wasn't like that," Sam said quietly. David stepped closer, his voice growing sharper. "Mr. Brooks, you've admitted to making mistakes in your past. Petty theft, trespassing, loitering. Isn't it true that you've had trouble staying out of trouble your whole life?" Rachel shot up. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness and attempting to prejudice the jury." "Sustained," Nora said firmly. "Mr. Sharp, rephrase your question." David's expression tightened, but he relented. "Fine. Mr. Brooks, you said you're innocent. If that's true, why were you found just 2 blocks from the scene with cash in your possession?" Sam's hands gripped the edges of the witness stand. "Because I didn't do it," he said, his voice stronger now. "I told the officers I didn't do it, but they didn't care. They just saw me walking, and that was enough for them." David opened his mouth to press further, but something in Sam's tone, something raw and undeniable, stopped him. For a moment, there was only silence. "No further questions," David said finally, his voice clipped. Sam returned to the defense table, his shoulders squared, but his face pale. Rachel leaned over to whisper something to him again, but Sam only nodded faintly, his hands still trembling. Nora looked away, her throat tightening. It wasn't just Sam sitting at that table anymore. It was every person the system had overlooked, every story that had been dismissed as unworthy of belief. When the jury was excused for lunch, Nora retreated to her chambers with the weight of the morning pressing down on her. She closed the door behind her, sinking into the chair at her desk. She needed a moment to think, to breathe. The questions circled in her mind like vultures. Why hadn't anyone looked for the red hoodie? Why wasn't the cash examined for fingerprints? Why did no one question the inconsistencies? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. "Come in," she called, her voice sharper than she intended. Sarah stepped into the room, holding a small stack of papers. "I found something," she said quietly, a determined look on her face. Nora straightened. "What is it?" Sarah handed her the papers. "I went back and pulled the surveillance report from the convenience store. Something about it didn't add up." Nora scanned the papers quickly. "What am I looking for?" Sarah pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. "The report says that the store's surveillance system automatically overwrites its footage every 48 hours. The video that was used as evidence wasn't pulled until 3 days after the incident." Nora's brow furrowed. "But that doesn't make sense. If the system overwrites after 48 hours, then the footage couldn't have been from the night of the robbery," Sarah finished softly. Nora's heartbeat quickened. "Are you sure?" Sarah nodded. "Positive. It means that the video the prosecution is relying on could be from another night entirely." Nora leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The video is the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence, she thought. If it's unreliable— "Thank you, Sarah," she said, her voice calm despite the storm building inside her. "You've done good work here." Sarah smiled faintly before leaving the room. Alone again, Nora let out a slow breath. This wasn't just about one man's innocence anymore. It was about a case built on shaky ground. A case that, if left unchallenged, would destroy a man's life. When court resumed, Rachel rose to address the judge. "Your Honor, the defense has discovered new information that calls into question the integrity of the surveillance footage entered as evidence. We request permission to bring this information before the court." David Sharp immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is grasping at straws." Nora's gaze hardened. "Overruled. Ms. Myers, you may proceed." Rachel approached the bench with measured steps. "Your Honor, as we've now confirmed, the surveillance system at the convenience store overwrites its footage every 48 hours. The prosecution's video, which was entered into evidence, was not pulled until 3 days after the incident. This raises a serious question. Where did that footage actually come from? A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Nora looked at David Sharp, whose face had gone pale. "Your Honor," David said quickly, "this is conjecture. The video is still consistent with the details of the crime." Rachel didn't miss a beat. "The prosecution cannot confirm that the footage is from the night in question. Without verification, it cannot be trusted." Nora's gavel struck once, silencing the courtroom. "The jury will disregard the surveillance video until its authenticity can be confirmed," she said firmly. David sat back down, his frustration evident. Rachel returned to her seat, her calm composure masking the victory she had just won. At the defense table, Sam looked up slowly. His gaze flickered to Nora, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. She held his gaze, unflinching. "I see you," she wanted to say. "I hear you." That evening, Nora sat in her living room, the day's events replaying in her mind. The cracks in the case were becoming impossible to ignore, but the weight of her position felt heavier than ever. She thought about Sam Brooks, the boy who once asked her if she dreamed of leaving Hammond. She thought about his voice on the stand, steady despite everything he had been through. And she thought about the red hoodie, the surveillance footage, the questions no one had asked until now. For years, Nora had believed that justice was blind, that it could rise above assumptions and prejudice. But what if the system she had trusted was not as infallible as she wanted to believe? She leaned back on the couch, the silence pressing in on her. There were moments in life, she realized, when doing the right thing was not about following the rules, it was about knowing when to question them. And this case was one of those moments. The courthouse was cloaked in an uneasy hush the next morning. The murmurs of reporters in the gallery were quieter than before, and even the jurors seemed more subdued. Something had shifted the day before. The questions surrounding the surveillance footage, the doubts creeping into the evidence, it had shaken everyone in the room, including Nora Whitman. She sat at the bench, the weight of her black robe feeling heavier today. Through her years as a judge, Nora had always leaned on the clarity of evidence, the clean lines of rules and laws. But now those lines blurred, and clarity felt further away than ever. The bailiff called for order. "Court is now in session," he announced. "Please be seated." Rachel Myers stood at the defense table, looking focused but tired. Her work over the last few days showed on her face, but her determination remained unshaken. David Sharp, on the other hand, looked wound tight, his jaw clenched as he sifted through the papers at the prosecution's table. "Ms. Myers," Nora said, her voice steady despite the weight pressing on her chest, "you may proceed." Rachel stood, smoothing the front of her navy suit as she walked toward the jury. "The last few days have shown us something important," she began, her voice clear and deliberate. "We've seen how easy it is to jump to conclusions, how a man can be accused of a crime without a single piece of physical evidence linking him to it, how assumptions can overshadow the truth." She turned and gestured toward Sam Brooks. He sat still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his expression careful. "My client, Mr. Brooks, has been accused of robbery and assault. Yet we now know that the store's surveillance footage, the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence, is unreliable. We know that the red hoodie the suspect supposedly wore was never found. And we know that the arresting officers didn't search for it, didn't dust for prints, and didn't investigate Mr. Brooks's alibi." Rachel paused, letting her words settle into the room. She turned to the jury, her eyes sweeping across their faces. "But what we've also seen, what we cannot ignore, is the humanity of Mr. Brooks. We've heard his testimony. We've heard about the night he stopped to help a man stranded on the side of the road. A man he didn't know, a man he owed nothing to. Why did he stop? Because no one else did. Rachel's voice softened, but it carried through the silent room. Is that the act of a man who would violently rob a convenience store clerk for a handful of cash? David Sharp stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is arguing character, not facts. Nora nodded, forcing her voice to remain neutral. Sustained. Miss Myers, stay on course. Rachel turned back to the jury. The facts speak for themselves, and the facts are this. The evidence against Mr. Brooks is full of holes. It relies on vague descriptions, on assumptions, and on the belief that he must be guilty because he fits a picture someone painted. She stepped toward her table. I urge you to see beyond that picture. I urge you to look at the truth. Mr. Brooks is not guilty. Rachel returned to her seat, and for a brief moment, the courtroom remained perfectly still. David Sharp stood quickly, his movements sharp and practiced. He turned to face the jury, his expression full of deliberate confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense would have you believe this case is built on shadows, he began, his voice firm. But let's be clear. The store clerk identified a man who matched Mr. Brooks's description. The police found him just 2 blocks away, nervous and carrying cash. Does it really matter if a red hoodie wasn't found? Does it matter if the surveillance footage was imperfect? Sharp walked slowly, his polished shoes clicking faintly on the floor. What matters is that every piece of evidence, when considered together, points to one conclusion: Sam Brooks committed this crime. The defense wants you to doubt what you know to be true, but doubt doesn't erase what we've heard. He stopped in front of the jury, leaning slightly toward them. The law does not require perfection. It requires reason. And reason tells us that Sam Brooks is guilty. David returned to his seat, satisfied. Nora watched him carefully. She could see the effort he put into his confidence, but underneath it, she sensed something more: frustration. The jury's faces remained blank, but Nora knew the truth. Rachel's words had planted doubt, and doubt was often enough to change the course of everything. As the jury was excused to deliberate, the air in the courtroom felt thick and still. Nora struck her gavel, officially calling for a break. Reporters shuffled out of the gallery, their hushed voices buzzing with speculation. Nora retreated to her chambers, her thoughts heavy and her mind restless. She poured herself a cup of tea and sank into her chair, staring at the scattered papers on her desk. She thought of Sam Brooks's words on the stand, because no one else did. For years, Nora had been proud of what she had accomplished. She had worked hard, built a life defined by order and discipline. But today, her success felt hollow in the face of everything she was seeing. The truth was messy. People were messy. And somewhere along the way, the justice system, the very thing she believed in, had forgotten that. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Sarah stepped into the room, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "You looked like you needed this," she said with a small smile. Nora took the cup gratefully. "You've been taking care of me all week, Sarah." Sarah shrugged lightly. "Sometimes people just need someone to show up for them. We all do." Nora froze for a moment, Sarah's words echoing in her mind. She looked up at her assistant, seeing her not just as a colleague, but as a reminder of the small, unexpected kindnesses that made a difference. "Thank you," Nora said quietly. Sarah gave her a reassuring nod and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. The afternoon passed slowly as the jury deliberated. Nora remained in her chambers, waiting for the word that a verdict had been reached. She paced the room at times, other moments spent staring out the window, watching the rain that had begun to fall. Every so often, her mind returned to Hammond, Louisiana, to the creek where she had met Sam Brooks as a child, to the day her father had pulled her inside the house and told her that boys like Sam didn't belong in her world. She thought of how easy it had been to let silence take over, to let lines stay drawn where they didn't belong. And now here they were, decades later, in a courtroom where Sam's fate lay in the hands of 12 strangers. When the call came, Nora felt the quiet buzz of her phone like a jolt to her system. She gathered her thoughts, straightened her robe, and walked back into the courtroom. The jurors filed in, their faces unreadable. The spectators sat still, the tension in the room taut as a wire. Sam Brooks sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly together. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Nora asked, her voice calm despite the pounding in her chest. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a steady gaze, stood with a folded piece of paper in her hands. "We have, Your Honor." Nora nodded. "Please read the verdict." The woman's voice was clear but soft. "In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Samuel Brooks, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." For a moment the room froze. The words hung in the air, almost disbelieving. Then a low murmur rose in the gallery, reporters scribbling frantically, spectators shifting in surprise. At the defense table, Sam Brooks sat still, his face blank. Then, slowly, his shoulders sagged, as if the weight he had carried for so long was finally slipping away. Rachel turned to him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as she whispered something. Sam only nodded, his eyes fixed ahead. Nora struck her gavel, her voice rising above the noise. "Order in the courtroom. Mr. Brooks, you are free to go." Sam rose slowly, his movements careful, as though he couldn't quite believe he was free. Nora watched him, her throat tight, as he turned to leave the courtroom. For a brief moment, he looked up, and their eyes met. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment, only a quiet understanding. And then he was gone, disappearing through the doors. Nora sat back in her chair, her heart heavy with everything that had led to this moment. The system had worked, but only just. Only because someone had dared to look closer, to question what others were too willing to accept. And for the first time in years, Nora realized that justice was not about perfection. It was about doing better, about choosing to show up for truth, for fairness, for people who had no one else to fight for them. The door to the courtroom swung shut behind Sam Brooks, and the sound seemed to reverberate through Nora Whitman's chest like a low, steady drumbeat. He was gone, slipping out into a world that had almost swallowed him whole. The gallery was still a buzz of murmurs and whispers as people gathered their coats, their notebooks, their thoughts. Reporters jostled for position in the hall outside, their questions forming an anxious hum. But inside, on the bench where she sat, Nora felt only silence. Her gavel rested quietly beside her hand. The black robe she wore, so often a symbol of authority, felt like a weight now, pulling her down into the polished wood of her chair. She had upheld the law. She had done what was required of her. And yet, for all the precision of the rules and procedures, the truth felt fragile, like glass that might shatter at the slightest touch. From her perch, she could still see Rachel Myers packing her files into a leather bag. The lines of her face softened with relief. The young defense attorney glanced up at Nora briefly, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Rachel had fought with everything she had, knowing how much this case had mattered. The bailiff stepped forward. "Court is adjourned, Your Honor." Nora nodded absently, struck her gavel softly once, twice, and stood. When Nora stepped into the hallway outside her chambers, the courthouse felt different. The polished marble floors seemed louder under her steps. The voices, low and urgent, seemed less like background noise and more like accusations of everything the system could not fix. Sam was nowhere to be seen. It struck her suddenly how quickly people disappeared in this place. A man's entire life had hung in the balance for days, and now he was gone, invisible once again. The crowd had already moved on to its next story, its next spectacle. Rachel Myers stood near the elevator, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. She caught sight of Nora and hesitated, as if unsure whether to approach. But she did, offering a small, tired smile. "Judge Whitman." "Ms. Myers," Nora replied, her voice even. "You did good work." Rachel's expression softened, a flicker of surprise passing across her face. "Thank you." She paused, glancing briefly at the polished floors, her words hesitant. "Not every judge would have handled it the way you did." Nora raised an eyebrow slightly. "And how's that?" Rachel looked her straight in the eyes. "With fairness." The words struck something deep within Nora, though she gave no outward sign of it. Rachel nodded once and stepped into the waiting elevator, disappearing behind its closing doors. Nora turned, walking back toward her chambers, her mind a whirl of thoughts she couldn't quiet. The afternoon light slanted across her office as Nora sat at her desk, staring at the neat stack of papers still waiting for her signature. The job never stopped, no matter the verdict, no matter the weight it left behind. She picked up her pen, but found herself unable to focus. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the small window overlooking the steps of the courthouse. That's when she saw him. Sam Brooks stood there, halfway down the steps, looking uncertain. His dark coat hung loose on his frame, and his hands were stuffed deep into his pockets, as if the simple act of walking out into the world required all the resolve he could muster. For a moment, he stood still, the crowd moving around him like water around a rock. People passed by without looking, men in suits, women clutching their purses, young law students with briefcases and hopes high above their heads. But no one stopped. Nora set down her pen, feeling something pull at her, an urge she couldn't explain. Before she could think twice, she grabbed her coat and walked briskly out of her chambers. Nora found him standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, staring off into the distance as though unsure where to go next. She approached quietly, her footsteps deliberate but soft. "Sam!" His shoulders stiffened, but when he turned to face her, his expression was more surprised than wary. Up close, the years showed on him creases along his forehead, silver threads in his hair, but his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were exactly the same. "Judge Whitman," he said, his voice rough. "You don't have to call me that," Nora replied. "It's just Nora." Sam studied her for a moment, as if unsure of her intentions. "Nora," he repeated slowly, the name tasting unfamiliar after all these years. "I wasn't sure if you were still here," she said quietly, gesturing toward the courthouse behind them. "I saw you through my window." Sam shrugged faintly, his hands still buried in his pockets. "Didn't know where to go, I guess." "Do you have someone to call? A place to stay?" He shook his head. "I'll figure it out." The words stung her more than she expected. "I'll figure it out." How many times had Sam been left to figure it out alone? They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging gently at Nora's coat. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't say anything during the trial," she began carefully. "But I remembered you, Sam, the moment I saw you." Sam's expression didn't change, but his voice was softer when he replied. "I figured you did." "I couldn't say anything then," Nora continued, "but I need you to know something now. I'm sorry." His brow furrowed slightly. "For what?" "For the way things were back then," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion pressing at her chest. "For not saying anything when I should have. For walking away when you needed someone to stay." Sam looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to see the truth of her words. "We were kids, Nora." "We were," she agreed quietly. "But that doesn't mean it didn't matter." The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the silence between them. Sam exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just enough for her to notice. "I stopped expecting people to say things like that a long time ago." "Maybe," Nora said, her gaze steady, "but that doesn't mean you shouldn't hear them." Sam looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, slowly, he nodded. Nora glanced up as Sarah walked down the courthouse steps toward her, holding a set of papers in one hand and her bag in the other. She hesitated when she saw Sam, but Nora offered her a reassuring nod. "Sarah," Nora said, her tone warm. "Can you call the shelter on Grant Street? Tell them I'll be sending someone over." Sarah's eyes flickered briefly to Sam, then back to Nora. "Of course, Judge Whitman." Nora turned to Sam. "They'll help you get settled for the night. It's a place to start." Sam studied her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded faintly. "Thank you," he said softly, the words carrying more weight than Nora expected. "It's nothing," she replied. But they both knew it wasn't nothing. Not at all. As Nora walked back into the courthouse, she thought of Hammond, of the dusty creek where she had first met Sam Brooks, of her father's voice pulling her back inside all those years ago. She couldn't change the past. She knew that now. But small acts of kindness still mattered, even if they came late. They could start something, a ripple in the water, spreading outward in ways no one could predict. And maybe, Nora thought as she reached her chambers, this wasn't just about Sam Brooks. It was about every other person she would see from the bench, every case, every story, every truth waiting to be told. Justice wasn't about verdicts alone. It was about seeing people, really seeing them. And that was where the real work began. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Nora Whitman sat alone in her chambers. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the faint hum of traffic from the street below. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as if the answer she sought might be written there. The trial was over. Sam Brooks was free. Justice had been served, or so the system would claim. But Nora couldn't shake the feeling that the word justice had more weight than it should, that it was heavier, messier, and far less certain than she had believed for most of her life. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment she had stood with Sam on the courthouse steps. He hadn't said much, and he didn't have to. The lines on his face had told the story of a man who had learned to endure day after day, year after year, without expecting anyone to fight for him. And now, she wondered, how many others were out there? How many men and women like Sam Brooks sat accused, unseen, and unheard, while the world carried on? A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," Nora called softly. Sarah stepped into the room, a folder tucked under her arm and a concerned expression on her face. "Judge Whitman, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to check in. You seemed quiet today." Nora offered a small, tired smile. "It's been a long week, Sarah." Sarah nodded, hesitating for a moment before speaking again. "I heard Mr. Brooks stopped by the shelter this morning. He's doing okay, from what I was told." Nora's chest loosened slightly, the tension lifting like steam off a cup of tea. "That's good to hear." Sarah lingered, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said carefully, "what you did for him yesterday. It matters. Even if it's just one person, it matters." Nora looked at her assistant, the young woman who had quietly reminded her of kindness when she needed it most. "Thank you, Sarah." Sarah gave her a small, knowing nod before leaving the room. When the door closed, Nora looked down at the papers on her desk, sentences, judgments, motions waiting for her approval. Each case represented a person. Each file was a life, summarized in lines of text. For so long she had treated them with the efficiency the system demanded. But Sam Brooks had changed something. The next day, Nora returned to the courthouse early. The halls were quiet, and the faint smell of coffee drifted from the staff break room as she made her way to her chambers. She had just settled in when Sarah poked her head through the door, her expression uncertain. "Judge Whitman, there's someone here to see you," Sarah said. "He's not on the docket." Nora frowned slightly, setting her pen down. "Who is it?" Sarah hesitated. "It's Sam Brooks." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Nora felt a tug of surprise in her chest, though she kept her face calm. "Send him in," she said quietly. Moments later, Sam stepped into her chambers. He looked better than he had days earlier, though the exhaustion still lingered in his eyes. He wore a clean shirt and an old but pressed jacket, his hands buried in his pockets. Sam, Nora said, standing. I wasn't expecting to see you. He nodded faintly, his gaze flicking around the room before settling on her. I hope I'm not bothering you. Not at all, she replied, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Please, sit. Sam hesitated before lowering himself into the seat. His posture was careful, guarded, the way it always seemed to be. I just wanted to say thank you, he said after a moment, for what you did, for what you said. Nora met his gaze, unsure of how to respond at first. I didn't do much, Sam. He shook his head. No, you did more than you think. You listened. You treated me like I mattered. He paused, glancing down at his hands. Not many people have done that for me. Nora swallowed, his words settling in her chest like stones. I should have done more back then, she admitted softly. When we were kids, I should have stood up for you. Sam looked up at her, his eyes softer than she had seen them before. We were kids, Nora. You didn't know any better. But you're here now. Nora nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. You're here now. For years, she had carried the quiet guilt of her silence, her inaction, in the face of the invisible lines Hammond had drawn between them. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it wasn't about what she hadn't done before. Maybe it was about what she could do now. What will you do next? She asked gently. Sam exhaled, the question seeming to linger in the space between them. I don't know yet, he admitted. The shelter's helping me figure out work. Something simple to start. Do you have family? Nora asked. Not really, no one close. He glanced out the window, his expression distant. It's strange. I've spent so many years just surviving. Now, for the first time, I don't know what comes next. You'll figure it out, Nora said softly. One step at a time. Sam looked back at her, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Maybe I will. He stood, his movements slower but steadier this time. Thank you, Nora, for everything. Take care of yourself, Sam, she replied. Sam nodded once more before turning to leave. As the door clicked shut behind him, Nora sat back in her chair, her thoughts lingering on his words. That afternoon, Nora stood at the window in her office, watching the street below. The people who moved in and out of the courthouse were a blur of suits, briefcases, and hurried steps. She had spent years looking at them from this distance, seeing the process, the procedures, but not the people. Sam Brooks had reminded her of something she hadn't wanted to face. Justice wasn't always served with clean lines and neat endings. Sometimes it was a fight against assumptions, a fight against a system that often closed its doors on those who couldn't afford to fight for themselves. She thought about Rachel Myers, the young attorney who had refused to give up, even when the evidence seemed stacked against her. She thought about Sarah, who always seemed to know when to offer small moments of kindness that made a difference. Nora had always believed in her work, her ability to interpret the law and uphold its principles. But now she realized that her position was more than that. It was a responsibility. It was a chance to make ripples in the water. The door to her office opened, and Sarah stepped inside with a small stack of files. These are ready for your review, Judge Whitman. Nora nodded, taking the files. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah lingered for a moment, as if sensing Nora's thoughts. Everything okay? Nora looked up, a faint smile crossing her face. Everything's fine, but I think it's time we start looking at things a little differently around here. Sarah tilted her head, curious. What do you mean? Nora's gaze turned back to the window, where the sun was beginning to sink behind the buildings. I mean that it's not enough to follow the law. We need to make sure we're seeing the people behind it, really seeing them. Sarah smiled softly. That sounds like a good start. Nora looked back at her, nodding firmly. It is. As Sarah left the room, Nora picked up the first file, her mind clearer than it had been in days. The past could not be undone, but the future was still hers to shape, one case, one person, one truth at a time. The soft hum of conversation filled the courthouse hallways as people moved with purpose. Lawyers carried their briefcases, clerks hurried with stacks of documents, and defendants waited with tired eyes for their names to be called. Judge Nora Whitman stood by her office window, watching it all unfold from above. It was the same scene she had seen for years, day in and day out, but today she saw it differently. The events of Sam Brooks's trial had cracked something open inside her, a shift, a realization that the law, the system she had dedicated her life to, could be imperfect, even when followed to the letter. It wasn't enough to uphold it blindly. It was her responsibility to make sure it served the people who stood before her, really served them. Nora straightened her shoulders and walked to her desk, where her assistant Sarah was organizing the day's docket. "Good morning, Sarah," Nora said, her tone calm but purposeful. "Good morning, Judge Whitman," Sarah replied, looking up. "It's a full day ahead. The first case is a misdemeanor theft." Nora nodded and glanced at the file on the top of the stack. The name printed there was unfamiliar, another person reduced to a single sheet of paper. But today, Nora reminded herself, she would look closer. "Sarah," Nora said thoughtfully, "have you ever heard of the community program at St. Joseph's Center? The one for first-time offenders?" Sarah blinked in surprise. "I think so. It's a restorative justice program, right? Counseling, job training, that kind of thing?" "Yes," Nora replied, her gaze distant for a moment, as she thought. "I want to look into it. People who need a second chance should know it's possible." Sarah smiled faintly, understanding. "I'll reach out to them today. I'm sure they'd be happy to work with the court." "Thank you," Nora said, the corners of her mouth lifting into a small smile. As Sarah left the room, Nora exhaled slowly and picked up the first file. One person at a time, she thought. If she could change something, no matter how small, it would matter. Sam Brooks had taught her that. Later that morning, Nora presided over her first hearing of the day. The courtroom was half full, the air heavy with the quiet rustling of papers and murmured exchanges. A young man stood before the bench, hands clasped tightly in front of him. He couldn't have been more than 20, his clothes worn but clean. His name, Marcus Tillman, was printed across the file Nora held in her hands. He had been charged with petty theft, a backpack taken from a convenience store shelf, likely because it was the only way he could carry his belongings. "Mr. Tillman," Nora said, her voice steady, "do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said softly, his eyes fixed on the floor. His public defender stepped forward, explaining that Marcus had no prior record and had been struggling to find steady work since leaving foster care. He had been living on the streets for weeks before his arrest. Nora listened, her gaze drifting back to the file in her hands. The details were all their names, dates, facts, but they didn't tell the full story. They never did. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent. Then Nora spoke. "Mr. Tillman," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "You made a mistake, but I see someone standing before me who has the chance to turn things around." Marcus finally looked up, his expression wary, as though he expected the worst. "I'm sentencing you to complete the restorative justice program at St. Joseph's Center," Nora continued. "You'll attend counseling, job training, and community service. If you complete the program successfully, this charge will not remain on your record." The young man stared at her, stunned. "You mean I don't have to go to jail?" Nora shook her head. "No, this program is a chance to build something better for yourself, Mr. Tillman. I suggest you take it." Marcus blinked, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Thank you," he whispered. I won't waste it, Your Honor." Nora nodded, her expression calm. "See that you don't." As the bailiff called the next case, Marcus turned and walked slowly out of the courtroom, his shoulders just a little straighter than they had been when he entered. Nora watched him go, a flicker of hope settling in her chest. That afternoon, Nora received a phone call from the director of St. Joseph's Center. "Judge Whitman," the woman said warmly, "I can't tell you how much it means to us that the court is considering our program. It's made such a difference for people who need a fresh start." "Thank you," Nora replied. "I think it's exactly what the system has been missing." "We'll be ready to work with anyone you send our way," the woman promised. "You're doing something important here." Nora smiled faintly. "I hope so." As she hung up the phone, her thoughts drifted back to Sam Brooks. She imagined him at the shelter, figuring out his next steps. For so long, he had been denied that chance, but now he was free. And if she could help others find their way forward, even in small ways, maybe she could begin to make peace with the past. Days passed, and the quiet hum of the courthouse continued, as it always had. But something in Nora had shifted. Each case she handled, each sentence she considered, carried new weight. One evening, as Nora gathered her things to leave, she stepped into the hallway to find Sarah waiting for her. "Judge Whitman," Sarah said with a small smile, "someone stopped by earlier and left this for you." Sarah handed Nora a worn envelope, her name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. Nora's pulse quickened. She took the envelope carefully, her fingers brushing the edges. "Who was it?" she asked softly. "Sam Brooks," Sarah replied. "He didn't want to stay long, just said you'd know what it was." Nora nodded, her chest tightening. She stepped back into her chambers, closing the door behind her before she opened the envelope. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper. "Nora, I'm doing okay. Got a job lined up. It's nothing big, but it's honest work. Thought you should know. Maybe you were right. Maybe one step at a time is enough. Thank you for seeing me. Sam." Nora sank into her chair, the letter shaking slightly in her hands. A quiet smile tugged at her lips, and she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. One step at a time, she thought. It was enough. As Nora walked out of the courthouse that evening, the air was cool and clear, the last traces of sunlight painting the sky in streaks of gold. She paused at the top of the steps, looking out at the city unfolding before her. The world wasn't perfect. It was flawed, messy, and unjust in ways that could break a person if they let it. But it was also full of possibility moments of unexpected kindness, chances to do better, to choose differently. Nora pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and began walking down the steps, her heels tapping softly against the stone. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future one case, one person, one ripple at a time. And that, she decided, was enough. The courthouse lights dimmed as the last clerk locked the heavy doors for the evening. Judge Nora Whitman walked the quiet halls one final time, her steps slow and deliberate. Outside, the air was calm, the city settling into its own quiet rhythm. She paused at the base of the courthouse steps, looking up at the towering building, solid, unwavering, and yet capable of change. Her thoughts turned to Sam Brooks. She imagined him walking down a new path, one without chains or closed doors. She thought of Marcus Tillman, the young man she had sent to St. Joseph's Center, standing at the start of something better. They were small victories, she knew, but victories nonetheless. Change didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly through small, deliberate choices. And for the first time, Nora felt she was part of that change. A quiet smile touched her lips as she stepped off the courthouse steps, heading toward her car. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new stories, and new chances to make a difference. And Nora would be ready, one step at a time. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in second chances, small kindnesses, and the power to make a difference, then I invite you to join us as we continue sharing these meaningful stories. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Stories of hope, justice, and perseverance. Thank you for watching, and remember, every small act of kindness creates a ripple. Be the reason someone believes in tomorrow.